The door clicked shut, and I stood there on my mother's porch with snow melting into my collar, my 2 daughters pressed against my legs, 7 and 4 years old, too cold and too confused to even cry anymore. "They can't stay here," my mother had said, glancing at my girls like they were something inconvenient rather than her own grandchildren. "If you want a roof, you'll have to come in alone." I hadn't even had time to respond before the door shut, the porch light clicking off a moment later, leaving the 3 of us standing in near darkness on a night when the temperature had already dropped below freezing. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since Marcus died, since a routine surgery had gone catastrophically wrong and left me a widow at 32 with 2 little girls and a mortgage I couldn't afford alone. 3 weeks since the life insurance company had informed me, almost casually, that Marcus's policy had lapsed 8 months earlier due to a payment error neither of us had caught in time. I'd exhausted every option I could think of before showing up at my parents' door that night. Every friend who could help had already helped. Every resource I could find had already been tapped. My parents' house had felt like the last possible refuge, the place where family was supposed to matter more than convenience. I turned away from that closed door, my younger daughter Mia beginning to whimper from the cold, my older daughter Josie gripping my hand tightly, silently, the way she'd learned to handle fear since her father's death. I had absolutely nowhere left to go. Or so I thought, until headlights swept across the driveway behind us, a car I didn't recognize slowing to a stop at the curb. My name is Elaine Marsh, and until 3 weeks earlier, I'd believed I had a stable, ordinary life. Married to Marcus for 9 years, 2 daughters who filled our small house with noise and laughter, a modest but comfortable existence built on his salary as a mechanical engineer and my part-time work as a preschool teacher. Marcus's death had come without warning, a routine appendectomy that somehow, impossibly, turned into a fatal complication during recovery. One day he was joking with the nurses about hospital food, the next he was gone entirely, leaving me to explain to a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old why their father wasn't coming home. The financial devastation came almost as quickly as the grief itself. We'd always meant to review our life insurance policy, always meant to double-check the paperwork, but life had gotten busy, the way it does, and neither of us had noticed when an automatic payment failed 8 months before his death, quietly lapsing coverage we'd assumed was still protecting our family. Without that safety net, I'd burned through our modest savings within 2 weeks, covering funeral costs, mortgage payments, and the basic necessities of keeping 2 grieving little girls fed and stable during the worst period of their young lives. My relationship with my mother, Doris, had always been complicated, strained by old resentments neither of us fully understood or addressed. She disapproved of my marriage to Marcus from the beginning, considering him beneath what she'd envisioned for me, and our relationship had cooled significantly over the 9 years of my marriage, though I'd never expected that old disapproval to extend to actively turning away her own grandchildren from freezing on her porch. The headlights behind us belonged to a car I didn't immediately recognize, an older sedan I couldn't place in the darkness, slowing to a stop at the curb in front of my parents' house. I had no idea, watching that car door open, that the person stepping out was about to change everything about what happened next. The woman who stepped out of that car was my Aunt Ruth Ann, my father's younger sister, someone I hadn't seen in nearly 6 years due to a family rift I'd never fully understood, something involving old property disputes and hurt feelings that predated my own marriage entirely. "Elaine," she called out, squinting through the darkness. "Is that you out here with the girls?" I hadn't even known Ruth Ann lived in the area anymore. The last I'd heard years ago, she'd moved several states away after whatever falling out had happened between her and my parents. "Aunt Ruth Ann," I managed, my voice shaking from cold and exhaustion in equal measure. "I didn't know you were back." 6 months now, she said, crossing the yard quickly, taking in the scene with visible alarm, my daughters shivering, my own face clearly reflecting whatever devastation I was barely holding together. "What happened? Why are you 3 standing out here in the cold?" I explained briefly, my voice breaking as I described Marcus's death, the lapsed insurance, my mother's door closing in our faces just minutes earlier. Ruth Ann's expression shifted from confusion to something harder, angrier, as she glanced toward my parents' house. "That absolute," she stopped herself, visibly restraining whatever she'd been about to say in front of my daughters. "Get in the car. Right now. All 3 of you. I hesitated, uncertain, still reeling from the rejection I'd just experienced. Ruth Ann, I don't want to impose on. You're not imposing, she said firmly. Your family, and apparently my brother's household, forgot what that word actually means tonight. I have a spare room, plenty of space, and absolutely no intention of leaving my nieces standing in the cold because your mother decided grandchildren were optional. What I didn't know yet, settling my shivering daughters into the warm back seat of Ruth Ann's car, was exactly why she and my parents had actually stopped speaking 6 years earlier, or how directly that old rift was about to intersect with everything happening in my life right now. Ruth Ann's house was smaller than my parents', but it felt immediately warmer in every sense that mattered. A cluttered, lived-in space filled with books and photographs, and the smell of something she'd apparently been cooking before rushing out to check on a strange feeling she couldn't explain. Something that had made her drive past her brother's house that particular night for the first time in months. I don't even know why I came this way, she admitted later, once the girls were settled with hot cocoa and a movie in her living room. I usually take the highway home from work. Something just told me to drive past. Over tea at a kitchen table, once my daughters had drifted off to sleep on her couch, Ruth Ann finally explained the rift that had separated her from my parents for 6 years. Your grandmother, my mother, left a small inheritance when she passed, Ruth Ann said carefully. A modest property upstate, worth maybe $80,000. She left it specifically to be split between your father and me, with a stipulation that if either of us needed emergency support, family included, we were meant to help. I listened, confused about where this was heading, exhausted enough that processing complicated family history felt nearly impossible. Your parents sold that property 6 years ago, Ruth Ann continued, without properly notifying me of the sale terms, without splitting the proceeds according to our mother's actual wishes. I found out after the fact, when a lawyer friend happened to review the property records for an unrelated matter. We haven't spoken since, not because I'm incapable of forgiveness, but because your father has never once acknowledged what he did, let alone tried to make it right. I sat with that information, understanding slowly that my mother turning away her own grandchildren tonight wasn't an isolated incident of coldness, but part of a broader pattern I'd apparently never fully seen clearly, a family history of prioritizing money and convenience over the people who should have mattered most. There's something else, Ruth Ann said quietly. Something I think you deserve to know now, given everything that happened tonight. That inheritance dispute, Ruth Ann continued, it's still technically unresolved. I never pursued legal action, mostly because I didn't want to drag out a painful family conflict any further than it already had been dragged. But I kept documentation. Property records, the original will, correspondence showing your father knew exactly what he was doing when he sold that property without properly compensating me. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, still trying to process everything happening simultaneously. Grief and cold, and this sudden unraveling of family secrets I'd never known existed. Because, Ruth Ann said carefully, half of that property's value was legally owed to me, which means, under the terms of your grandmother's will, if I chose to pursue it formally now, your parents would owe me a substantial settlement. And Elaine, I think, given what just happened on that porch tonight, I'm finally ready to pursue it. I hadn't expected this conversation to become about money, about old family disputes suddenly resurfacing at the worst possible moment. But something in Ruth Ann's expression told me this wasn't really about the money for her either, not entirely. I'm not doing this out of spite, she clarified, as if reading my hesitation. I'm doing this because your mother just proved tonight that this family has a pattern of choosing convenience over the people who should matter most, and I think it's finally time someone held them accountable for that pattern, in whatever way actually gets their attention. 2 weeks later, Ruth Ann's attorney sent a formal letter to my parents, outlining the inheritance dispute, requesting a settlement that would resolve 6 years of unaddressed financial wrongdoing. I hadn't asked her to do this, hadn't expected the events of that freezing night to spiral into a legal confrontation, but as the weeks unfolded, I began to understand that Ruth Ann's actions were creating an opportunity one hadn't anticipated, one that might finally provide the stability my daughters and I desperately needed. My parents' response, when it finally came, arrived not as an apology but as a defensive, dismissive letter from their own attorney, disputing Ruth Ann's claim entirely, suggesting the original property sale had been handled appropriately according to their interpretation of my grandmother's will. What they hadn't anticipated was that Ruth Ann's documentation, carefully preserved for 6 years, was thorough enough to make their dismissal legally untenable. Property records showing the actual sale price, correspondence proving my father had specifically avoided informing Ruth Ann of the transaction until after it closed. Even an old voicemail Ruth Ann had saved, where my father had briefly, carelessly mentioned handling things quietly to avoid what he'd called unnecessary complications. Faced with mounting legal pressure and the very real possibility of a costly public dispute, my parents settled 3 months later, agreeing to pay Ruth Ann the outstanding balance owed from the original property sale, plus accumulated interest for the years the debt had gone unaddressed. Ruth Ann, without my asking, without any expectation of repayment, used a significant portion of that settlement to help stabilize my situation, covering several months of mortgage payments while I found stable full-time work, establishing a small trust for my daughter's future education, ensuring that the freezing night on my parents' porch would become, eventually, a turning point rather than a permanent crisis. My relationship with my parents remains distant, formal, built now on the clear understanding of exactly who showed up for my daughters when it actually mattered, and who didn't. My mother has attempted, occasionally, to reconnect, though her attempts feel more focused on managing her own guilt than genuinely repairing what she broke that night. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive her for that moment, watching her glance at my shivering daughters like an inconvenience before closing the door. But I've stopped needing her forgiveness or approval to build a stable, loving life for my girls. Something I've learned, through everything that happened, doesn't actually require the family members who taught me that love was supposed to be conditional. So I'll ask you what I've asked myself since that freezing night. If the people who were supposed to protect you turned you away in your most desperate moment, would you have found your way back to stability? Or would that rejection have simply been too devastating to recover from?